Hi, it's Amy from A Marina Designs, and today I'm here to walk you through how to create this plaid panel Christmas mug rug. I love mug rugs. They are a fun, quick project. They are great for working on your technique. They are great for gifts. They're easy to mail. There's just lots of things to love about mug rugs. This pattern can be found in my Etsy shop, and I will include a link to it in the video description. It includes 3 different mug rug styles as well as 5 different applique patterns. And today we are going to, like I said, focus on this plaid panel version. So to begin, in the pattern, it's going to have a list of the directions of the widths and lengths you will need for your strips. Now we are going to build our grid, and a couple of tips that I have when you're choosing fabrics for this project. The first and most essential is that the way the directions are written, the fabric you use needs to be non-directional fabric. We're going to turn some 90 degrees to sew them together, and we're going to have things, smaller pieces kind of coming together. So it's important that you make sure that your fabric is pretty non-directional. Now, you might notice that this plaid that I'm using is a little bit directional because of this white stripe in here. And so as long as your direction is going the same on all of them, it's fine. But there is no real right up or down to this fabric, which is what's most important. So just make sure that whatever fabric you're using, that it's non-directional. And another tip for choosing fabric is it really works best because these are really tiny squares. So these are like 3/4 of an inch once they're finished, that you use fabric that is really small in scale. Because if you try to use something that has even a medium scale to it, you're going to lose any of the images or anything like that. So make sure that you're picking something with a really small scale. And actually, it's really good if you're using like a tone-on-tone or something with not a huge amount of contrast to it, to make sure that all of your pieces are kind of clearly defined and you can really see the whole texture of the plaid look to this. Another thing that you'll want to pay attention to is the contrast between your corner squares here, your grid fabric, as well as your background, that will then become the background for your applique. So when you're choosing the fabrics, just make sure that you're aware of where things are going. If it's going to become the background for your applique, you want to make sure that your applique is going to really stand out. And again, these are pretty small pieces. So if you choose something that has some scale to it and behind it, you might lose some of the detail of your applique. So choose things that don't have a ton of image to them. Like this is a cross stitch fabric from Lori Holt. This is one of her B basics. And it just has just enough to give it a little bit of texture, but not so much that it's going to distract from your applique. So make sure that you're paying attention to what fabrics you're going to go where, the contrast and distinction between them, and make sure that you don't have anything that has a real definite up or down. Words, things like that are going to really make this much more complicated. All right, so we are going to move on. We're going to cut our strips. And again, all of the measurements are found in the pattern, so I'm not going to share those here. And you're going to have pairs of fabrics here. So you'll notice that there are 2 different fabrics of each length, and those are going to get paired together. Then you are going to put them right sides together along one long edge, and then sew down that long edge on all 3 pieces using your 1/4 inch seam allowance. There is a little bit of play in here, so if your strips kind of shift off a little bit, we are going to square up our ends, so you don't have to be super, super careful, but try to get them lined up pretty neatly. Now, before we get sewing on these, I have a couple other tips for working with small fabrics. The first one is to start your pieces. Now, you can either do it before you cut your strips or once your pairs are sewn together. that would be another good time to starch it before you subcut it down into the smaller pieces. Starch is going to help your fabric keep its shape and help keep your stitching lines straight and everything kind of coming together well. The second tip is once these are sewn together, so let me pull over these ones that I have already sewn, is to press your seam allowances open. This is going to reduce some of the bulk as you are overlapping seams and things here. It's going to help you keep everything kind of more neat and flat. Also, you're going to want to make sure you are using a really consistent seam allowance. So if you are a little off one way or the other, it's more important that you do the same for all of it. But it is pretty important to have a pretty accurate seam allowance here and try to stick pretty close to your 1/4 inch seam allowance. It will help all of your shapes kind of come together a little bit better. So once you have your strips sewn together and then you have pressed all of the seam allowances open, then we are going to take each of our strips and you are going to cut them down into smaller pieces. So you have little pairs. And again, these measurements will be found inside of your pattern. So you're going to take each of these 3 strips and then you're going to cut them down into the widths and numbers indicated in the pattern. Once you have all of that done, we're going to come back and start assembling our mug rug quilt top front. Okay, now that we have all of our pieces cut, we are going to start assembling the rows. So this particular one is put together in 3 different rows. So we have a top row, a middle row, and a bottom row. Now these 2 rows are the same, one just gets flipped around. Again, this is why it's important that the fabrics are non-directional. So we are going to take 4 of our cornerstone pieces and 3 of our middle pieces, and we're going to arrange them just like that, and then we are going to sew them together along these short pieced sides. So a couple of tips when you're doing this is you're going to want to make sure that you are lining up, see if I can get that to focus in. You want to make sure that you're lining up the seams really well. What I like to do is have them lined up, and then I will put a pin. So if I am feeding it into my machine from this way, I will put a pin in this side of that seam in order to keep that seam lined up as well as I can and allow for that seam to kind of start getting under my presser foot into my needle before I pull that pin out, just to try to prevent as much shifting as I can as I'm sewing those rows together. So I'm going to create 2 rows that are going to be identical to this. And then we are going to take these larger pieces and then we are going to turn them 90 degrees. So again, this is why we make sure we're using non-directional fabric. Then we are going to place them so that the bigger square is to the right, the smaller strip is to the left, and arrange them like this. And then we have this one extra piece that we are going to sew onto the end. And again, we're going to sew these all together along the short rows. So once we have all of those sewn together, we have our 2 cornerstone rows and then our 1 applique row. So I'm going to take one of these rows and I'm going to flip it around like this. And then we will just sew these 3 rows together. And again, I have pressed the seam allowances open on all of these seams, and I will do it again for this final seam. And then it is ready to add the applique, quilt, and bind it. If you have any questions about doing the raw edge applique, like I have done on here, I have a full set of video tutorials that you can find here on my YouTube channel, walking you through all of those steps. And also, if you have any questions about how I like to bind small projects like this, again, I have another playlist that shows all of the steps that I take to do that. So once you've sewn all your rows together, quilt it and bind it. Your Christmas mug rug with your plaid panel style front is all finished. I hope you have a great day and come back for more sewing tutorials. And until I see you next time, happy sewing, friends.